Hello and welcome to the One Giant Leap podcast with me, Jeff Shrimpton. And today I've got a very special guest, which is a little unusual to the business guests that I usually have on, and that's James Polanski. Now, James Polanski is universally known in my house as Mr. Polanski, and that is because he is the headmaster of my children's school, or more accurately, you were the headmaster of the school. You're now the executive head for several schools, aren't you, James? Say hi, by the way.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me, Jeff. Yeah, that's correct. So from September, I'll be executive head of two schools.
Excellent. So there's Boundary Oak School, which is where my kids are at, and which other school?
Conifers Prep School in Midhurst.
Excellent. Okay. Now, I remember when I was looking for schools for my children, and I'd recently read the book Mindset by Dr. Carol Dweck, which I want to talk to you about today. And that book is about developing a growth mindset. And I was really intrigued as we visited the school to see posters all over the walls in every single classroom talking about growth mindset. So I immediately thought, well, heck, we're probably pretty aligned by this as well. And I remember I think it was the first year we were there. At the end of that year, you were quoting one of my other favorite books, which is Black Box Thinking by Matthew Said as well. So I knew at that point that we were definitely aligned in some of our philosophies. That's why I want to talk to you about growth mindset, because I know that it's really important to you in the direction that you give to the teachers and the children, that growth mindset is an important thing for you to develop within the children. So I'd love to ask you the first question then, if just in case people haven't read that book, and I recommend it an awful lot. How would you define growth mindset and its opposite, which is fixed mindset?
Sure. So for me, growth mindset is all about self-improvement. And you're right to highlight the fixed mindset, because actually it's much easier to explain when it's diametrically opposed by a fixed mindset. And a fixed mindset is where you believe your ability is innate. It's by and large hereditary, and there's very little you can do about it. And where it's really, athletes have known this for years, but where it's very pertinent, and I think where Carol Dweck has done her best work, is around intelligence. We've had this belief that intelligence is fixed. You either have it or you don't. You're born an academic or intelligent, or you're not. And growth mindset really is the antithesis of that. So you have the growth mindset is where you believe that your traits, intelligence or otherwise, are not fixed. And that you can do something about it and you can improve it. And the best analogy, although scientifically it's not exactly correct, but the best analogy is like a muscle. You can train a muscle to get more flexible, to get stronger, to have quicker reactions. And the same way you can train your brain to be better, to be more intelligent, to be more resilient, to ask better questions, and your work ethics in a similar vein. So growth mindset is being able to improve, in a school setting, is to be able to improve academically and in other areas as well, without feeling that you're either good at maths or you're not good at maths, or you're either good at this at languages, you're not good at languages, or you're either good at music, you're not good at music. So growth mindset is the opposite of that. You don't believe that traits are fixed and you can do something about it and continually improve.
It's a bit like changing an I can't to a how can I, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. We use the word yet. I can't do that yet. But there's always the ability in the future to be able to do it.
Yeah. So thinking about it, and the human brains, I always think are very complex things. And I think it's not quite as simple to say that one person has a fixed mindset and one has a growth mindset. I'm mindful, one of the first clients I ever worked with his business had a very, very fixed mindset. But he's an engineer. If you put him in front of a machine, he suddenly developed this incredible growth mindset that said, I will fix this machine no matter what. I'll try whatever, and I won't leave until it's done. So it's not quite as black and white as you're fixed in your growth. It's sometimes it's on certain topics you can have that mindset, isn't it?
It's highly contextualized, and it's not just in certain areas. So the one you mentioned is a perfect example. And there's a lot of pupils who on the sports field will have a growth mindset, but in the maths class will have a fixed mindset. So it's contextualized from that point of view, from the subject, but it's also contextualized in terms of where they are and who's talking to them. So you'll often find, or we found often, that pupils in a classroom had developed this great growth mindset and they'd try really hard in the classroom, but it wasn't being transferred to the home environment. And you know, when mum or dad sits down and tries to do homework with them, they suddenly develop this fixed mindset, I can't do it, whatever. And they're not, and so we struggle with that. And that's one of our challenges as educators we have, is that whatever skills we impart with this growth mindset otherwise, that it is transferable out of context. And we do, you know, that's one of the hardest things that we find, is that pupils get into their head, you know, that they're used to having this growth mindset at school or in a certain classroom, but they move and that kind of disappears. And for me, one of the biggest areas that we've worked on, and I think it's the lowest hanging fruit as well, actually, is all about language. It makes a huge, huge difference. And just changing your language can have a dramatic effect on someone's mindset. And equally, it can undo all the good work as well. So if a child goes home and the parent is there going, you know, I was never any good at maths, so don't worry about it, they can completely unravel that growth mindset and turn them back into a fixed mindset. So the context, location, and language you use are all vastly, you know, very important.
Yeah. So how would we spot, unlike you, James, I listen to the advice of don't work with children and animals, but I mostly work with adults. But you know, it's going to be probably mostly adults that are listening to this. And I'm sure obviously some of them will be parents, will be listening in the context of both for them children and for themselves. But how would we spot that we ourselves are in a fixed mindset situation and that we need to change? And also the people, whether it's a team that we're managing or our own children, how do we spot it in them?
You know, we've mentioned some of the vocab already, but it appears first and foremost, I think, in the language. So, you know, people who say, I'm no good at this, or that's not in my skill set. Oh, you know what, you know, I'm not great on this side of things, I'm not great at communicating. All that kind of language, it alludes to a fixed mindset. So that's one thing in the language. The second thing you can spot quite quickly is fixed mindset people tend to focus on the outcome. You know, they seem to have this defined notion of, you know, you're really good at something and this is the outcome that's going to happen. Whereas a growth mindset person really focuses on the process, the journey. Not the outcome, not the end destination. The end destination is quite fluid. It's the journey there. And as long as you have the right process in place, you will do better and better and better. And so the goal, the outcome is never fixed. It's very, very fluid. And having a fixed mindset is the opposite of that. I think fixed mind people tend to have a defined outcome. And they compare themselves a lot. So fixed mindset people are constantly comparing themselves to others, when actually, you know, if you're focused on the process and the journey is very much pertinent to you. It's your journey. And a growth mindset person is very reflective, very responsive to feedback. And actually it ties in nicely, you know, you mentioned black box thinking, but it ties in very nicely with, you know, incremental marginal gains. It's all about those little gains that you make by really applying yourself to the process, rather than fixing on the end goal.
Because fixing on that end goal that then is either success or failure, then quite often leads to self-sabotage and not even trying in the first place, doesn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. And when you think, okay, I'm going to fail, I might as well just give up. And we see that in kids a lot, you know, when they know that they're no longer, you know, you're doing a quiz or whatever, and they suddenly realize, actually, even if I get all the rest of the questions right, I'm still not going to win. And they kind of just give up. And that's the exact opposite. And you know, I say to my kids, I'm really disappointed when kids get 100% of the test, because essentially it shows me there's no opportunity to learn from it. So, you know, I tell my kids they should be disappointed if they get 100% in the test. You know, it's not getting it right. It's that, you know, some people call it a failure or mistake, whatever, but it's not getting it right. It just provides fertile learning opportunities. And it's all about those learning opportunities. If you're a growth mindset person, all you want to do is learn and improve. And if you don't get those opportunities to improve, you're not going to learn. And so you almost welcome challenging questions. You welcome challenging work, because you know if you don't get it right, you're going to learn something from it. And that's the crucial bit.
There was a part in the book that really struck me when he was talking about children and specifically about exams, and how if a child's got a fixed mindset and they're saying, right, now we're going to judge you, and the child goes, no, you're not, I'm not playing, which very much related back to my school days, is where the grades I got, I probably could have got an awful lot more if I'd had a growth mindset. But it wasn't until in later years I realized that I was controlling the failure. So if I could have a laugh about it with my friends and go, ha ha, I didn't really try, then I was in control of that. And at the time, I felt like I was winning. Obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, I realized I was punching myself in the face. And, you know, it's something that I have to watch in later life as well. Do you notice that happening as well?
Yeah, and it's interesting because, you know, the brain's an incredibly fascinating organ, and it goes through various stages. And it's really interesting because you think you've cracked someone, you know, when they're 8, 9, 10 years old, and then suddenly adolescence hit and new hormones come through the body and they have these whole new perceptions they start to develop. And you almost feel like you have to start from scratch again and build them up again and build their resilience and build their reflectiveness and their responsiveness around their new biology that's happening in their body. And, you know, I always warn my teachers, don't ever pick a fight with biology because you're going to lose. So, you know, be very cognizant of what changes, particularly teenagers are going through, because teenagers, you know, a lot of people don't get this right at all. Teenagers go through a period where, yes, they're experimental. Yes, they want to try different things. Yes, they're slightly more impulsive in certain areas, but actually they have a deep-rooted belief of what's fair. You know, they are starting to question processes and whether they're fair or not. And this, you know, a lot of adults label them as you know, having a problem with authority. They don't have a problem with authority at all. They just question everything, and quite rightly so. And us as educators and parents as well, you know, we need to be able to answer their questions and be very cognizant of what's going through their head and the hormones going through their body. And it's the same with growth mindset, because you can have a fantastic growth mindset, you know, 10, 11-year-old, and they hit puberty, they hit adolescence, and then suddenly you've got to start all over again. So yeah.
Because I notice fixed mindset showing up in my clients sometimes, and the clients I work with, they're quite often they're very good at doing the thing that business does, but I have to round them on all the other points. And one of the things I hear a lot is, I'm no good at numbers when talking about a profit and loss account. And my answer is, well, can you add? Can you subtract? And at a push, could you do a percentage? And which, of course, the answer is yes. But then just that thought process of I'm no good at numbers stops them from even looking at that. And I've noticed it takes quite a while for people to get into it, and then they go, oh my God, this is so easy. What was I doing? But it's that initial point where they would maybe look at a profit and loss account, which has just got a load of numbers on it. And almost if they're in that fixed mindset about it, the brain just doesn't analyze what is actually very simple mathematics, does it?
Yeah. And again, context is so important, you know, your location and context, because, you know, as you say, you know, you're at a school, if you've got a school that embraces a growth mindset and embraces mistakes as learning opportunities, and everyone's on board and everyone's open about it and everyone talks about their mistakes openly and almost proudly. And then suddenly you leave school and you get a job and you go to an organization where they don't have that. It makes it really tricky. And, you know, you have all these issues that people talk about, imposter syndrome and everything like that. And it's really all around language, a new environment where people, you know, either pretend that they're brilliant at everything, or if they're not good at something, they hide it rather than embrace it as a learning opportunity. And I know, you know, in Black Box Thinking, he went through several industries and comparing them, you know, the aviation industry for one, where, you know, it's transformational to a culture if they have this openness about mistakes and how to improve on them. And I think that's really tricky, you know, as kids move and adults through various rites of passage and coming into a new environment and new culture. And bear in mind, you know, Jeff, you know, you and I are converts of this, but, you know, you can go from a school where 80, 90% of the population is firm believers in growth mindset, and you can suddenly move into a job or a university where that number goes from 90 to 10%. And you almost feel like you've got to battle this all over again. And you've got to be really strong. So you've got to think about, right, this is about me. This is about me improving. It's you know, it's not me comparing myself to others. And they may have fixed mindsets, but I'm going to stick to my growth mindset. And that can be tricky to do when you know, not everyone buys into it. So there's a generational change, I think. And that gets harder and harder as you move, you know, into adulthood.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So thinking about like a business owner who might be listening to this podcast, and they're all, I haven't met a business owner yet that doesn't want great leadership in their business and wants to really look after and develop and nurture the people within their business. What advice would you give to them if they've got an employee, we'll call him Bob, and you could see that Bob is capable of so much more than he has, but he's shut the learning shutters down and saying, I can't. What advice would you give to that person so that he could assist that person and get Bob to open up and actually develop himself?
Yeah, for me, it's small steps. And to get them on board, it's got to be around something that they can see the difference relatively quickly, and they can buy into it, and they can see, okay, it's worked for this, and then you can go, well, it's worked for that, it's going to work for this, and this. So small steps, and make it something that they can relate to, and something, as I said, that they want to improve in. So for me, what's been tried, at school, it's very hard because with my staff, with kids, it's relatively easy, but with staff, it's quite hard because, that they teach 6 hours a day, and you hardly see them. And staff, you have 5 inset days a year in which to do training for staff. But what's been transformation in my staff is, and COVID actually perversely has helped with this, is online learning. There's some fantastic websites out there, whether it's universities and their MOOCs, or whether it's companies like Udemy that have these excellent programs online that cover a wide range of areas, any area you can think of. So you go to member staff and go, okay, look, what area would you like to improve on? It doesn't necessarily have to be work related, but let's get you started thinking about becoming, a self-motivated learner. And give them like a little online course to do, that they improve a skill that they want to improve at, and then you can see how quickly they can improve. Because I think the thing that people are probably least knowledgeable about is how the brain works, and let's say neuroplasticity, and the idea that you don't have a fixed number of sort of dendrite connections in the brain or synapses. You can keep growing and keep growing and keep growing, and actually quite into adulthood, right until your last few decades of life, you can continually grow your gray matter and your neural networks and connections and learn new skills. And yes, there's a huge amount of pruning that goes on the brain. If you don't use those skills, you quickly forget about them. But I think people would be astonished at how easy it is to learn a new skill. And once you show them that, and you go, okay, well, look, you've learned that skill and you've learned it from scratch, and that's transferable. You can learn other skills. You can suddenly become really good at certain things. For me as a head teacher, I was probably grew up as one of the most shy and introverted boys you'd ever meet. And for me, the idea of becoming head where you're front of house, it filled me with dread. I'd wake up in a cold sweat about it. And yet, I had to reflect back when I was asked to do it as deputy head. And I was like, okay, well, look, I've got to have a growth mindset about this. I've got to get up in front of people and start speaking to them. I remember, you were probably there, Jeff, but I remember when I did my first speech, when it was announced I was going to be head, and at speech day, I was still deputy head, and I asked to give a talk because I wanted to prepare myself. So I said, no, I'm going to give a talk when I'm deputy head about becoming head. And I forced myself to do it. And I embraced it. And I'm not great at it still, but I'm getting much, much better. And that's a continuing self-improvement growth mindset in terms of my public speaking and being front of house and communicating with a large number of people. So it's doable. It's very doable. And you can, I'd start small steps. You can model it for them, but for me, small steps, get something that they're interested in, that they haven't quite got the skill for yet, and show them how easy it is to learn a new skill, and show them how plastic that brain is in terms of learning.
I like that switched on for me when you were speaking is quite often in that scenario when we're talking about Bob, the employee, the business owner or manager goes, Bob needs to get better at X. And this is a thing we need to get Bob better at. But actually, what I'm hearing from you, and I've just kind of realized is sometimes the best gift we could give Bob is not that he gets better at X, that if he's really interested in Y, we could get him better at that so that he can go, oh, well, that was better. And then you're almost teaching how to learn rather than the knowledge itself, isn't it?
100%. It's all about the process, and it's all about, whether you call it work ethic or learning, it's all about the process, and that is so transferable. So our whole praise system at the school changed from being based on outcomes to being on process. So all the rewards now around effort and process and thinking, and how much effort you put into your work, how many times you redraft your work to produce your best work possible. And it is all about the process, and that process is transferable. So, you know, we'll often start here with some of the hardest nuts to crack. We'll start in something that they really enjoy, let's say football, and get them to learn a new skill in football. And, you know, how many hours did you spend learning that skill? Like, can you imagine how good you'd get something else if you spent that many hours doing that thing? And it's all about the effort, putting in the effort and getting good at it. So 100%, don't start with what's their biggest bugbear or the biggest hurdle. Start with something different and then make that a transferable skill.
That's potentially the thing that they've got most fear around anyway, isn't it? So
yes.
Asking them to overcome their biggest fear first time is probably a big ask, isn't it?
Exactly.
And a bit more softly catchy monkey.
Yeah, exactly right.
Now that's really interesting. I'd love you to explain a bit more to people listening what you mean by neuroplasticity and how that works as well.
Yeah, so again, I'm not the world's expert at it, but as I understand it, you know, when you learn, your neurons fire between each other when you learn a new skill. And the more you practice that skill, you know, the stronger that connection becomes between the synapses, the neurons. And you think of it as a sort of weak electrical link, and the more you practice it becomes solid and almost set. And that's neuroplasticity, in that your neurons can grow, and you know, there's no limit. This is the most interesting thing. It's not like your brain it's got a maximum capacity, and this is where I think, you know, AI has got it a bit wrong, because they're not modeling the brain. It's very, very different to how the brain works, and I think AI make much bigger leaps if they actually learn about how the brain works and then model the brain. That aside, but it's all about the strength of these connections. So you learn a new skill, the more you practice it, the stronger that connection becomes, and it becomes much more permanent. And there's no limit. So you can build as many of these connections as possible. So there literally is no limit to what you can learn, skill-wise or otherwise, in your brain, as long as you practice it and as long as you maintain that. If you don't maintain that skill and you no longer use it, the brain, you know, it's an organ, and we, you know, evolutionary will always have a tendency to increase efficiencies where we can. And the brain is probably the most, you know, energetic, or, you know, energy using organ the body has. So if you don't use something, it'll start pruning it. So if you don't use a skill, you don't use a language or whatever, it'll start trimming those neural connections, so you forget the skill and you unlearn it, essentially. But as long as you keep learning it, keep practicing it, keep using it, you can build as many of these connections as possible. So the brain is very plastic in that regard. You know, it can grow skills in areas of the brain, unlimited.
And you can train it as well to make these new neural connections, can't you? Just with simple things like, it's so hard to drive to work a different way to the way that you always drive, because you just go. But if you start going, just go drive a different way, or sit in a different place when you go to your favorite coffee shop or something, it just trains the brain to be looking at new different pathways, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you know, there's various roads we can go down, but, you know, there's a big difference between short-term, you know, working memory, where it's very very hard to hold memories and hold knowledge, and you really want to embed that in long-term memory, where it stays there, it has a much greater degree of permanence in the long-term memory. So for us, you know, when we're teaching, you know, there's a famous saying that says learning or memory is the residue of thought, and you need to think about something really hard for it to form a connection, but for it to keep, you've got to repeat it over time. So it becomes almost a habit, and it goes into your long-term memory and out of working memory, which has a limited capacity for storage. So you've got to repeat it, so it becomes ingrained in long-term memory, and then you can access it much more quickly, and there's a greater degree of permanence about it. But in order for that to happen, then it has to become a habit. And so we talk a lot about learning habits here, and making sure, you know, there's a famous Aristotle quote that says, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, therefore, is not a single act, but a habit. And I talk about kids, you know, if you want to be excellent, you've got to make excellence a habit. You've got to do that day in, day out. That hard work, that growth mindset, that process, that work ethic, that effort has to happen every single day. And if it happens every single day, it becomes a habit, it goes into long-term memory, and it just happens like that. And it's much more
really
efficient,
useful,
energy-wise.
So thinking about how an organization or a company will reward their employees or recognize their employees, traditionally it's outcome focused. So and so made some great sales, or did really well at that, was successful in that part. How can someone listening to this switch? Because essentially you when you're going outcome focused, you're encouraging a fixed mindset around that. How can an organization change to recognizing and rewarding people with a growth mindset of doing their absolute best work and trying new ways, rather than just going outcome focused? What can they talk about or install?
Yeah, look, it's really, really hard, because in an ideal world, the whole point of this is that actually you shouldn't need rewards. This should be intrinsic self-motivation.
Good point.
And so, almost I sort of cringe when we have to reward kids, because it's kind of like, well, you should be doing this all about you. It's about you self-improving. That should all be intrinsic, not external motivation. So yes, so it's a bit, I find rewards slightly cringy, and it is really, really tricky. But for me, it's all about praising the effort and thinking, an example is a scientist, who's trying to work on some research and can spend thousands and thousands and thousands of hours, testing things and not coming up with, the theory that solves everything. And yet they're still doing incredibly valuable work. And you wouldn't want that scientist to stop. And so doing thousands of repeated experiments and failures, well, they're not failures. It's a necessary part. So yes, look, rewarding outcome is very, very tricky, because, as soon as you start rewarding outcomes, you take the emphasis away from the process and the effort and the work ethic of all those people who are doing fantastic work, who might not necessarily reach their own goal. So it's praising the effort and the process. But for me, it's how do you encourage, that self-motivation, that intrinsic motivation? What can you do to encourage that? And it's not easy, because actually it's different for every single person. So for me, it's really about the dialogue, getting to know your employees. And look, it's really hard. If you're a big company and you've got 1,000 employees, it's nigh impossible. But line managers should get to know that their employees inside out and what makes them tick, and then reward them, accordingly. And for me, the best reward I can give, again, the reward is for the time and the effort. So I can have a member of staff spend hours researching, let's say, a new element of research in pedagogy or some new cognitive science and how it impacts the classroom. They can do hours and hours and hours of research, and we trial it, and it just doesn't work at our school. But that member of staff spent a huge amount of really valuable time doing something that was incredibly useful. It didn't happen to work at the school, but they should be rewarded for that. So, how you do that is, your employees inside out, what makes them tick. And mainly the main reward that we find is time. My staff members need time, and that's the best reward you can give them. So if they work really hard, you give them, you go, you know what, I'm going to cover you for this morning, go off and do something, whether it's your wife or you go to the gym, whatever it may be, but just find something that motivates them. And that's very personalized. But as I said, rewards are a difficult thing. And it does, ideally it'd all be intrinsically self-motivated and there'd be no need for rewards.
So the funny part is then the growth mindset award of the month is kind of missing the point of itself, isn't it? That's a really important point. And what I'm hearing for you really is it's not so much a conversation that happens in the 6-month review or the team meeting, but it's more about the way that every conversation is driven through there, where you're really focusing on people doing their best work. And what they've learned, and what they're where they've stepped up to the mark, and how they've done things differently, how they've adapted to change, how they've overcome perceived failures. Those are the things that we want to recognize in the moment, rather than just trying to lead our team in a 6-monthly appraisal.
Yeah, and also, the thing I find that really, really helps is just give someone a purpose. If someone has a purpose, they are much more intrinsically motivated. They have a purpose, they have a drive. They might not have a passion, but at least if they have a purpose, they know what path they're on. It doesn't need an outcome, doesn't need a destination. But if I ask the member of staff to go and research something and see if they can implement it in the classroom, it doesn't matter if it doesn't work out. They've now got a purpose. They know what they're supposed to be doing, and they can go along that journey and get very, very far. They might not reach the destination, but just that journey in itself is incredibly important. So I think, getting a purpose, giving staff members a purpose is very, very important for their mindset.
Great. That's a fantastic way to sum up, I think. James, I'm struggling to call you James because Mr. Polanski is how you'll know. Thank you so much for being on the call today. I know that the people listening are going to get loads of value from this. I'd really like to finish off by recommending Boundary Oak School to anyone who's listening, because my kids absolutely love it, apart from one of them who's rolling around on the sofa at home clutching a poorly tummy today, which I'm not quite sure about, but generally speaking, they absolutely love being there. And I definitely recommend that school to everybody. So, and please remind me again of the other school that you're in charge of, the name.
So it's Conifers Prep School in Midhurst and Boundary Oak School in Fareham. So thank you, Jeff. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you for being on, and thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of the One Giant Leap podcast.